Okay, well, very wonderful and happy Sabbath to all of you. It's great to be here. I so look forward to the Sabbath day every week. Had a nice conversation last evening with Ms. Sandra Robinson from Australia, and she's doing well, and I'd like to send a hello from her to our brethren. So there was a great controversy in the church, and the controversy was essentially regarding circumcision. I think it's interesting sometimes as we put ourselves into these stories and you look at some of the discussions, some of the controversies that took place early in the church in the first century. It's I think it's sort of interesting to contemplate within ourselves which side of the argument would we have fallen on. But there was a controversy regarding circumcision that had arisen. That controversy, I think it's important to note, was there because certain men made it so. There were certain men that were riling things up. They were not the apostles, and they were usurping authority that simply did not belong to them. And so the matter had to be settled because it was becoming quite contentious. We read in Acts 15 that whole story and what we call the Jerusalem Conference. And we learn important lessons, many important lessons in Acts chapter 15. We certainly see that God uses apostles as the teachers who instilled to the church its beliefs, its practices, its customs. And as members, we are required, and I don't use that word lightly, it's not a suggestion. We're required by God to believe and speak the same thing. I'd like to take a look at something here in Acts chapter 15, and as this controversy was settled, certain points I brought up here, Acts chapter 15, I like to drop down into the story. And if you would, let's go to verse 19. Now, Peter, being the chief apostle, again, remember, they're all apostles. They're of equal rank, but as a leader, Christ made Peter and named him Peter, meaning the stone, the leader of them. He makes a decision. James, as a local pastor, the chairman of the meeting, if you will, voices it as well and backs that up. But here's a decision. And in Acts chapter 15, starting in verse 19, he says, "Therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath." And so why do we read, brethren, in Acts chapter 15, that the Gentile converts do not have to observe the law of Moses except for these 4 points? Again, he mentions 4 points. "Therefore I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath." Why are these 4 points mentioned? Why are we told that the Gentile converts, those who are in the church of God, do not have to observe the law of Moses except for these 4 points? Why these 4 points? And the title of the sermon is 4 Points to Ponder. 4 points to ponder. So let's answer a question initially of what is the law of Moses? We say, well, they don't have to keep the law of Moses, except these 4 points are mentioned. What is the law of Moses? Because this area, if you will, can be tricky. It can be confusing sometimes for many people. And some get sort of tripped up, regarding the difference or similarities or how it works together, how one expounds the other when we're talking about the 10 Commandments versus the law of Moses. And a lot of times to turn there, but some will use Luke 2 verses 22 through 24, in which the ceremonies of the law of Moses are also called the law of the Lord. And so you have this similarity, this conjunction as they work together. And then so sometimes people get tripped up. Why is the law of Moses also called the law of the Lord? Why would we have that synonymous statement or that synonymous sentence? When you go back into Leviticus, for instance, and you think about Leviticus 23, and you think about all those things that Moses gave to the people, over and over and over, right? God spoke to Moses. God said, God said, God said, man. So in other words, it's important for us to always remember, no matter what we're talking about when it comes to laws and commandments, statutes, and judgments, all law comes from God. Moses was not a lawmaker. And that's a very important point. Moses was not a lawmaker. Moses merely told the people the laws that God set in motion. God is the lawgiver, not Moses. The law of Moses, though, is never called the Ten Commandments. They're two very distinct things, yet again, they work one to another. The law of Moses comprises of statutes and judgments, which God gave to him to communicate to the people. The difference is that, you go into Exodus 20, for instance, and God spoke the Ten Commandments, and then all the statutes and judgments were delivered by Moses, and of course, written in a book. Now, remember, though, that when Moses first delivered the statutes and judgments, the law of Moses did not contain something. What did the law of Moses not contain when it was first given? Most of you probably know the answer, but we would certainly reference Jeremiah 7, verse 22. And there's other scriptures, of course, that we could turn to. The sacrifices were not a part of the original law of Moses. They weren't included in the original part of Moses. They were added later. As a matter of fact, they were added about a year later. And why were they added? Because of the sins of the people. Because they were falling short on what they had, on the things that they were given. They couldn't even do that. And so the sacrificial system was added to the law of Moses almost, or I say roughly, about a year later. Notice, if you would, and we'll come back to Acts, but notice Malachi chapter 4. Let's just notice here, and it tells us about the original part of the law of Moses. Malachi chapter 4. And we'll just notice, if you would, verse 4, Malachi 4:4. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and the judgments. That was the original part of the law of Moses. And brethren, we are not to forget this law. We are to keep this law. But added to this law, and like I say, about a year later, were other statutes regulating the material rituals. Now, there had always been sacrifices. We can read all throughout the Bible, well before Exodus 20, where all kinds of individuals were performing sacrifices. But when we come to the codification of the Ten Commandments, when we come to the Old Covenant, and as we go on through that, God regulates it and develops a system by which they were to follow. And of course, you have the priests and the Levites and that whole system that we read about and throughout the book of Leviticus. But those laws, laws that regulated the material rituals, and again, we're talking about the sacrifices, the lighting of candles, the burning of incense, the various washings that are talked about there for the unclean. All of that was later added because of the sins of the people. And so what we find, brethren, is the law of Moses, and this is an important distinction. The law of Moses has two distinct parts to it. Two distinct parts. Number one is the civil aspect, the civil laws. And number two is the ritualistic aspect of it, or the sacrificial system, as we sometimes call it. those were the two distinct parts, excuse me, of the law of Moses. Now, the civil law of Moses, as I've mentioned, works in conjunction to, expounds, if you will, the Ten Commandments, oftentimes revealing how we apply the Ten Commandments. How does the rubber hit the road, so to speak? The day-to-day living of it. As an example, do we find that we are to observe Passover, unleavened bread, trumpets, atonement, tabernacles, last great day? Do we find that we are to keep those days in the fourth commandment, which says, thou shalt keep the Sabbath holy? We don't find it there, do we? All we find is, thou shalt keep the Sabbath holy. So how do we know about the expounding annual Sabbaths? How do we know about that? It's through the civil laws of the law of Moses, which expounds upon the commandments. So we have the fourth commandment, and then all that applies to the fourth commandment. That's the civil law of Moses, which we are not to forget, and which we are to keep today. So then why do we read in Acts chapter 15, getting back to now our question, that the Gentile converts do not have to observe the law of Moses, except for these 4 points that were mentioned? Notice Acts chapter 21, if you would. Let's just go a little bit further back into the story. Acts chapter 21, and I think we'll see it makes it plain for us. Acts chapter 21. And notice, if you would, verse 21. Paul, he writes here and he says, but they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews. He's talking about Paul. They've been informed about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. According to the customs. And so the law of Moses, remember we said it has two distinct parts, the civil and the ritualistic. The law of Moses that's being called into question involves the customs. Not the civil law, but the customs. They were accusing Paul of not teaching the customs. And this controversy did not involve the civil aspect or the civil law of Moses in any way, shape, or form. It's having to do with the added ceremonies and the rituals, the customs that were added about a year later. So here we find, again, these 4 points that were given as a part of that decision that was made by the apostles, 4 points that are binding on all Christians, even into this very day. We are not to eat blood. And when he's saying eat blood, in other words, we're not to ingest it, not to ingest blood, animals which are strangled, meats offered to idols, or to practice fornication. Why is that? Why? Because why those 4 points? Well, here's where it comes into our understanding. These 4 points, although they were in the customs and a part of the rituals and the sacrifices, these 4 points, these 4 were also originally a part of the civil law of Moses. They were also originally part of the civil law of Moses. They were also included later on, about a year later, with the added ceremonies to regulate the sacrificial system. Remember, there was lots of people that sacrificed, but once that system was brought into place and put forth by God, and they were to follow that, these 4 points were added, taken from the civil law and added to the customs. Why that? Because the Gentiles, as you go back into many of their practices, they typically ate their sacrifices with blood. They typically strangled their animals, typically presented them to idols, and a lot of times, and again, it's a whole study you can do, but fornication was quite often a part of their religious ceremonies. even in Corinth, it was an issue, and Paul had to address that when you understand the history of that area. So to prevent these pagan customs being practiced by Israel, God included these 4 points that were in the civil law, and he brought them over into the rituals. He brought them over into the rituals because he did not want Israel practicing and following and obeying God in that way. He wanted that distinction made. And again, to prevent them from doing so, these 4 civil laws were included also in the rituals. But when the ceremonies were declared, when the customs were declared no longer binding in Acts chapter 15, these 4 points had to be brought up. And these 4 points had to be declared that they are still binding, because some of them would have been confused and some of them would have thought that they were abolished along with the temporary rituals. But again, they were also part of the civil laws. So since these 4 points were a part of the civil law, before they were added to the rituals, they remained binding. They remain in effect to this very day, even after the abolition of the physical sacrifices and all the various washings and customs that were no longer binding as a part of the law of Moses. 4 points to ponder.